I wasn't a seeker. I didn't know I was a seeker when I started out seeking. I was born and raised in Germany, and
Where to?
Frankfurt.
Mine?
Uh-huh. Yes. And when I was about 17 or 18, I got into jazz and the whole beat poetry and smoking pot and all the things that one did at that time. And I met an American who was stationed in the military, as we were occupied at the time. And we married in Germany. And rather than living in Germany, which seemed a very narrow-minded place for me at the time, it's gotten much more open now, I would imagine. But post-war Germany it seemed very restricted to any sort of new thought, at least so I perceived it. We could not. I had. I'm sorry, I'm thinking. I had taken to buying pot from Arabs and selling it to Americans, and this is how I earned my spending money. I was going to school at the same time, but in the process of doing that, I also got caught by the police. So I was only 18 years old, and it was a very new thing in Germany at the time. So for punishment, they sent me 2 weekends to this youth jail, from Saturday morning to Sunday evening. This is so I wouldn't miss school. But at the same time, what it did do, it gave me a police record for drugs. And we did not have, it wasn't separated at the time that if you had a youth record, it was expunged or something. It was just a police record. And so after Mick and I were married, we were thinking of going to the United States, and I went to the American consulate to apply for a visa, and they asked for my police record, and we got the police record, and I was refused to entry into the United States because you cannot come to the United States when you have a record for drugs. At least you cannot come as an immigrant, and if you're married to an American, you cannot come as a tourist. You have to immigrate as being married to an American. So we could not come here, and we didn't want to stay there in Germany. So we did what was actually fairly popular during the 60s in Europe, and that is we got a backpack and a sleeping bag and I don't know, maybe a few dollars, and we decided to go on the road. And going on the road was, well, a lot of people did that. People hitchhiked all over Europe, and it was a safe thing to do at the time. It wasn't like now where you would feel that you get kidnapped and raped and mugged, and I mean it was a very pleasant thing to do for students. Everyone kind of did that on holidays. The entire student population sort of hitchhiked off to France and Italy and stuff. It was a real common thing to do. But we were going to go just a little further than that, and we decided that we were going to go on to Asia. And we had a friend from Iran who imported carpets from Iran into Germany, and he bought used Mercedeses and drove them from Germany to Iran, and we helped him drive a couple of those cars. And he gave us some money for that, and we drove from Frankfurt to Tehran with him, and we got to Tehran with our backpack and our sleeping bag and our $100, and we decided we'd go east. And there were quite a few European and American people who were on the road at that time, and there was sort of this little stream of beatniks and hippies and whatnot going across Asia. And we eventually got to India, and we enjoyed it because in India there were these they called them the sadhus. They were the Indian holy men with long hair and orange robes and matted hair. Some were naked, had ashes rubbed all over them. And what they did is they sat around and they smoked pot. And they did this liberally. And we really related to these guys. We liked them. They were kind of more like us. They were sort of they had dropped out of their society. And they were sitting around getting stoned. And that was just exactly what we had done. Except they had this sort of religious bent to it. They somehow had their people believing that they were spiritual or were attempting to be spiritual or were in fact spiritual. And so the population of India actually feeds these people, actually takes care of them. And they beg and they give them money. And so we thought they were really clever. They had not only found a way to just sit around and do nothing, but actually they were being supported by the society. So we liked these guys. We really didn't totally understand the spiritual end of it, because Hinduism was not something that, as far as I'm concerned, can be understood. It was so complicated and weird and strange and all these peculiar gods and stuff. But we liked the Sadhus, and so we sat around with them. And in fact, Mick liked them so much that he started wearing these orange robes and started looking like one of these people. And he let his hair grow and his beard grow. And so we sat around India for a while, like that. And eventually we went to Nepal, and we went to Southeast Asia, and we went all the way to Japan. And from there we thought we would like to try to go to the United States. And in Japan we had brought with us a few pounds of assorted illegal items, and we sold that to American military in Japan, and so we actually had a fair amount of money with us. And we thought we would come to the United States from Japan. And so we went to the American consulate in Tokyo, and they said, oh, well, you fill out all these papers and then you get your police record, and then you go on. And so we wrote to Germany, and we got my police record, and it was the same thing, and it said that I had a record for drugs, and so again I was refused a visa to come to the United States, and we had really kind of come to the end of our road being in Japan. And so we decided, well, let's go back to India. And we turned around. But we were so aimless. At this point, mind you, we had been traveling for about a year and a half. And we made a living occasionally we would buy handicraft things and we would send them to the United States, and we would have friends sell them for us. We bought, I remember, embroidered dresses in the Middle East and just items like that. But also, of course, we would take drugs from one country to another and sell it for a profit. So when we turned around, we took a ship from Tokyo, and we were really kind of out of it as far as what was happening in the world. We hadn't really, we were not into reading newspapers or anything. We sort of knew there was a war going on over there someplace, but we didn't really pay that much attention to it. And we took a boat from Tokyo, stayed in Hong Kong for a while, to Saigon. And what our idea was, we were going to get off in Saigon and take a boat up the Mekong River and go to Cambodia and Laos.
What year is this?
1965.
Oh my God.
So when we got to Saigon and the French boat, I think it might have been the last boat in or out, and it was just unbelievable. We could hear the bombs and see them in the distance, and the whole town looked, evidently all the villages and all the people that come into Saigon, and the sidewalks were packed with refugees that lived there on the streets, and all these young American kids, and I was just horrible. So we asked the purser, the purser on the ship, if we could please get a ride out of here, and he took us for free to Singapore. And just sort of to illustrate how kind of aimless we were. We really didn't, at that point, we were going nowhere. We had no idea where we were going to go or how we were going to live. So we eventually ended up in Singapore. And in Singapore, we met this American fellow. There were always places where sort of people that traveled on the road congregated, and the Sikh temples were one of those places, because Sikhs allow people to sleep in their temples for free. And so often that would be sort of the crash pad for the roving travelers. And we were at the Sikh temple in Singapore, and we sat outside at the tea stall, and there was this American fellow. And he told us he was going to India, and we, of course, we would always light up pipes and whatnot, joints and so on, and sit around and smoke, just out in the open at that time. For Singapore today would be slightly different, but at that time it was not illegal anywhere, nowhere. And so we sat there talking to this fellow, and he said he was on his way to India, and in India he was going to meet a man named MeherBaba, who was his guru, his teacher. And fine, we'd never heard of MeherBaba, but we certainly had many gurus and teachers and all that. We were acquainted with that. He had never been to India before. And we offered him whatever it was we were smoking, and he said, "No, thank you, I'm trying not to take drugs because MeherBaba doesn't want me to take drugs." And we were really surprised at that. What? I mean, that was unusual to us, because all the sadhus and swamis and whatnot smoke this stuff. What do you mean he doesn't? And so we suggested to him that if he wanted to take drugs, he should just find another Baba. There were lots of Babas. And they all like to do this, such as they, you know. That's how serious we took his thing. So then we went on to Ceylon. He went on to India, and we went on to Ceylon, and then eventually ended up in India. And somewhere along the way, we kind of thought that maybe we should stop taking drugs. And it was because we really had become, life didn't have any meaning. We were so lethargic. We were so, we just dragged ourselves around. And we really felt maybe we should do something. We should stop taking drugs. Perhaps that would be the thing to do. And we arrived in India on the 31st of December. And we said, hey, this is it, New Year, we're back in India, this is where we wanted to be, and so let's stop taking drugs. So we decided that's what we were going to do. And we walked around the streets of Bombay for a while, and there was this roundabout, kind of an intersection with a sandstone fountain in it, and there was no water in the fountain. And people lived in the fountain, as if you've been to India, you see people living anywhere. And people lived in this traffic circle in the fountain. And we sort of sat on the edge of the fountain. And the guy over here was filling one of these Indian chillum pipes with hashish, and he passed it on to us, and we just took it and smoked it. And so our New Year's resolution lasted until about 10 o'clock, 2 hours before New Year even, until about 10 o'clock at night. So that was that, as far as stopping taking drugs, that thought right straight out. And we were, even though we didn't really realize it and we didn't acknowledge it, but we were getting so desperate in our just walking around the world like ants that we sat in this fountain with these homeless beggar people for 3 weeks. And we just, you know, we would roll our sleeping bags out, rats would run around. There was one guy in the upper tier. The fountain had this upper tier and then the lower tier. One guy lived actually in the upper tier, and he had his business there. What he was doing is he had this wooden box with different oils, bottles full of oil, and he would massage people. They would lie in it, and he would massage them with the oils, and then he would wrench them around. He actually was like a chiropractor that lived in this fountain. And adjust people's backs. So it was quite a crew.
And no
that
rent.
did- No, it was quite cheap, that's true. One guy wore a lot of coats, he had a whole bunch of coats, 5 or 6 coats. And his name was Anthony, although he was a Hindu. And Anthony was the only one who didn't take drugs. And Anthony went with his little bucket to the temple every day and brought back dal and chapati, food, and fed everybody in the family. Anthony, I think, was cool in hindsight. So desperation was obviously getting deeper here, and we really didn't even notice it. And so we decided that we should get out of Bombay, and we hitchhiked out, and we ended up in Pune on the first night. And there we remembered that Steve Simon had told us that this MeherBaba lived. So we asked the fellow we stayed in some free bed hotel by the train station. We asked him if he had heard of Baba. And the fellow in the hotel said, oh yeah, he lives right down here on Bund Garden Road. And so we took a rickshaw and we went down to Bund Garden Road to Guru Prasad. And I remember pulling up in front of Guru Prasad, and I could not believe it. This was a palace, this was a mansion. This is supposed to be a Baba. I mean, these guys sit on the river, on the Ganges with robes on or naked. And he had this mansion. It was very unusual to me. And we walked into the garden, and a fellow came up toward us, and we said, are you Baba? And he said, oh, no, I'm just the gardener. And he said Baba did not live there. He was only there a couple of months in the summer, and that he lived in Ahmednagar, and that we needed to go to the Baba Center in Pune, and the fellow would send a message up to Baba, and this is how we would get to see him. And he told the rickshaw driver the address of the Pune Center, and we went there. Now, to me, this was already kind of too much effort. I was like, oh, come on, let's just, yeah. But here we were, and we met a man named Ramakrishnan who ran the center there. And he said Baba is in very strict seclusion, he's seeing absolutely no one. But I would send a message, and you come back in 3 days, and we will see if he wants to see you. And we said, okay, you do that.
I'm sorry, this is
65.
60,
Early 66. Yeah, early 66,
66.
yeah. And just the January, I guess, of 66. And so he said he would send a message, and we said, okay, you do that. And then we never went back to see what the answer to the message was. We just sort of spaced out and decided to go on. We were going to go to Hyderabad. We had no reason to go to Hyderabad, but we sort of determined we'd go to Hyderabad. But then, I don't know, we didn't get a ride, and some guy picked us up in a Jeep, and he said, you're going to Hyderabad, why? And we said, we don't know. And he said, oh, we should go back to Bombay. So we said, oh, okay. Walked on the other side of the street and hitchhiked back to Bombay. We were very out of it. So whatever Baba said to the message that Mr. Ramakrishnan said, I'm sure it was no. And so we ended up in Delhi eventually. And Mick, at this point, somehow was, I didn't really know where this came from, but one day he said he wants to go see this MeherBaba. And I said, why? We just came from there. We didn't even go back to hear the answer to the message. And and this is not my favorite part of India by any means, Avataric area. And I said, oh, come on, if you want a guru, let's go up to the Himalayas, let's go to Rishikesh. And we actually sort of looked into that a little bit. We found a school in Bengal where you could learn how to levitate in a 6 weeks course. There's something, something positive to do. But we never went there. But somehow we kept insisting on wanting to see this MeherBaba, and I didn't understand why. But so he wrote a letter, to Baba, and he addressed it MeherBaba Ahmednagar, that's all we knew, and asked if we could come to see him. And this really was Mick's thing. I didn't much, I didn't really participate in this. I really didn't want to go back down to Ahmednagar. So we wrote him this and asked him if we could come to see him, and he wrote back, don't come to Ahmednagar, remember me wholeheartedly and you will feel my presence wherever you are. My love blessings to you. And then he gave us the address of Baba Wazido Kane in Delhi that we should go see. And so Mick was so happy that he had written to us. Oh, he showed his cable to everybody. But we did go to see this Mr. Kane. And Mr. Kane said what we should do is write to Baba and tell him about ourselves. Tell him whatever we could think of. And Mick did all this. Oh, and by the way, Mick spoke perfect German, and we communicated in German, and my English really wasn't very good. Not that it's that good now, but I didn't speak English very well at that time. So Mick wrote, so all the correspondence at that point was still done mainly by Mick. And he wrote to Baba, and well, it was, of course, what he wrote I agreed to. And we basically told him that he was American and I was German, and the only thing we knew about MeherBaba was that he didn't like drugs, because Steve Simon had told us that. And we were heavily into drugs. And we wrote to him in this letter, we told him that we were taking drugs and that we were living on the road and like that. And MeherBaba wrote back and he said, stop taking drugs and go home. Basically, maybe not in exactly those words, but it's here somewhere, I'm sure. Here. Well, maybe it was in a couple of letters. In this letter it says, beloved Baba wishes you both to return home as soon as possible and to remember him with all your heart wherever you are and wherever you go. These letters were either written by Adi or by Erich. Oh yeah, and then another letter came. And in this he says, enclosed is a typed excerpt of reply to a letter from one in the USA. He had sent us a letter that Alan Cohen had sent to Baba. For your information on Baba's wish for drugs and indulgence therein, other than medicines for physical ailments. And Baba wants you both to return to the USA immediately as soon as you can. And Baba wishes you not to feel disappointed for not being permitted to see him while in India. And he wants you to go to him with other Western lovers when he gives the call, and Baba will see that you both can make it along with other Western lovers when the opportune time comes. And there's some other things. And so we wrote to him and we told him that we couldn't go to the United States because I was unable to get a visa, and that we wanted to stay in India. And meanwhile, I had also heard from some friends and from my sister that when I did this thing in Germany, I did my 2 weekends in jail, I actually didn't stop selling drugs. I continued to sell drugs, and somehow the police had found it out, and they were sort of waiting for me to get back to Germany. So I wasn't eager to do that. And we explained to him that we couldn't come to the United States. And so he wrote back again, and he said, you try. And we explained to him that we would like to go to the United States, but we can't get a visa. And he said, you try. And we went to the American Embassy in New Delhi, and we applied for an immigration visa. And as a rule, even for countries like Germany, where the quota is very, very large, a lot of Germans could immigrate to the United States at that time, it still would take a minimum of 3 months to get a visa. And they asked me for all these papers and this and that, and I had to go get a physical and fill out endless forms. And they forgot to ask me for my police record, and I had an immigration visa within 3 weeks. And to date, they don't have my police record. Anyway, we did not, certainly I did not, give Baba any credit for this. It was, well, hey, they forgot, big deal. It could happen, right? The United States Consulate forgets. And so now that we had a visa to come to the United States, we were sort of eager to do that, and what we were going to do is hitchhike to Europe and fly. The cheapest way to get across the Atlantic was to fly from Iceland, from Luxembourg to Iceland to New York, and it was $100. And it was a propeller jet, and it took 24 hours or something. This is in the 60s. So we wrote back to Baba, and meanwhile, in some of these other letters that we would write to him, we would always kind of pester him. In fact, there's one letter in which we said to him he should see us because he saw Steve Simon, the fellow that told us about him in Singapore, did get an audience with him, and so we said, but you really should see us because you saw Steve. Eh? So we were not exactly, that respectful. But meanwhile, the fellow that Baba asked us to meet in Delhi was Igor Kane. He was a Baba lover in Delhi. He had given Mick a copy of God Speaks, and then there were individual pamphlets of discourses, and there was a discourse on the Avatar and a discourse on the God-Man. And I was unable to read English at that time, but also I wasn't really very interested. This really was more a mixed thing. And so when we wrote, and Mick read these books, and when we wrote to Baba and told him that we got an American visa and that we were leaving to go to Europe and to go to the United States, Adi sent a cable and said that MeherBaba wants to see us for 5 minutes only on March 7th, 1966. And I remember thinking, 5 minutes, 800 miles the other way, and the way we traveled took a long time to go 800 miles. And so, but Mick was so happy, he thought, he was just ecstatic. So we wrote to Adi. Adi wanted us to meet him, for us to take a certain train that was the Delhi train that goes to Ahmedabad. But we didn't take trains, we were hitchhikers. So we hitchhiked and took the train that Adi was to meet, the Delhi train, from the last stop before Ahmednagar, which was Manmad. And so Adi could meet us on the train. And Adi had Baba's old 56 Chevy, or 57 Chevy, this old big car that Baba drives around sometimes now. And he met us at the station, and originally in the letter he said that we had to meet Baba at 9:30 at Meherazad, but then he had changed it to 9. Now how are we to know? Because we were on the road for 5 days. And so when Adi said, come on, and we were late, you changed the time? We didn't know that. But anyway, Adi was very eager that we would be on time, and he buzzed us out there to Meherazad from the Ahmednagar station. And Meherazad was quite different from what it is now. We went in the main gate that's at the end of the road. That was the only gate, and none of those structures over the dispensary, and none of that was there yet. And the entrance to Mowgli Hall, the building just ended. There was no awning and there was no porch. It was just dirt that came right up to that green door, and with a wooden bench, some funky wooden bench up there, but you sat in the sun. There was no overhang and no porch. And Adi said, you sit here and I'll go in. And Adi went in, and we sat there, and Nick said, oh, what are we going to do? Oh my God, what are we going to do? We should have brought a coconut to offer at his feet as the symbol of our mind or something, and what are we going to do? And we were sort of stressing about what are we to do when we're walking in, and this old guy, tall man, came up. He had a beard and a staff, and he came up and he sat next to us and he said, Amrika? And we said, Amrika. And that was Baidu, the old must. He was from Yazd. And so we sat there, and then Adi came up, and Adi said, Baba says you are not to touch his feet and give him namaskar, you're just to sit down, and go in to sit down. And Adi walked in first, and Baba was over there in the corner in his chair. And I remember when I walked in, and then Mick walked in, I walked in last, and I remember seeing a bunch of people, and I remember thinking that was really strange. They were the men Mundley, they sat there on the floor, and I don't know what I expected. I think I thought we were going to be alone with him or something. Now, somewhere in the midst of all this, I did know he didn't speak. I think Mr. Kane had told us that. I knew that, but how I thought this was all going to happen, I guess I didn't think. But I remember seeing all these people, and I noticed one of them was a Westerner, and I guess that was Francis. And we turned and looked toward Baba, and he sat in his chair, and he went like this. So obviously what Adi had said, you're not to go in and embrace him and touch his feet or something, Baba was sitting there like this, so we kind of got the message. So Mick walked up and embraced him, and then I embraced Baba, and he sat in this chair, and the chair is a very small chair actually. It's not a huge chair, but in it he seemed to almost disappear. He was tiny. And that's just the way I saw it. And when you see pictures, it seems like the back of the chair was over his head. He really was a small man. And he was, of course, this is the middle of the seclusion, and he didn't look well. The color of his skin, I thought he looked sort of yellowish. He didn't look well, and it surprised me. I don't know what I expected. I'd seen a picture at the Pune Center that at the end there are these steps and there's a full-length painting, and I had seen that. And so he motioned for us to sit down. Everything just kind of happened real fast. You don't just hang out and look, and it just like he motioned us to sit down. And Adi sat on the floor next to Baba over there. And so he was within our line of vision, and all the men were down there. Erich was where he ordinarily was, except I never turned. Once I walked in and I saw Baba, I never turned my head again, and I never saw Erich, except that Baba's voice was coming from there. Once I looked at Baba, I never stopped looking at him. And we sat kind of under where the quark is, where the Hafiz board is on the wall. And as soon as I guess I'm assuming everybody's been there. I'm sorry. So as soon as we sat down, Baba immediately started gesturing. And he said, "How did you sleep last night?" And we said, "Fine." Of course, we didn't sleep at all because we were waiting for this Delhi train, but we didn't want to complain, I guess, so we just said, "Fine." And I sort of had a chance to look at him a bit more as I was sitting there, and I noticed that he had really beautiful hands and feet, and that his hands were just incredible. I mean, almost like a woman's hands, very, very fine and very well kept, and his feet, his toenails and all. For someone who walked around India in these sandals that he had, maybe some of you must have seen the sandals that he had, and for so many years, and with the Indian dirt, to have such exquisite feet, it was amazing. And he had when he wasn't gesturing to Erich, he had his hand hanging down, and he was doing this thing with his hands where he was and it was fascinating to me. I didn't know what he was doing, and I was watching him. And the other thing that I noticed was that he never looked at anything for very long. His eyes, incredible eyes, and they just sort of more or less darted around the room. And that video that you were showing.
Beyond words?
Yeah, that is the closest to what he looked like that I have ever seen. I've seen obviously lots of pictures of Baba, and that Louis van Gasteren footage is just amazing. That is the closest to that. That's almost the only thing that I've ever seen. Certainly for the time, 1966 was toward the end of his life, but certainly I have never seen anything that looks more like him than that. And you can see in it every once in a while, he sort of shoots one look into the camera. His eyes, they're just fantastic. And but there was not really much time to sit and take it all in because he kept talking and Eric would talk. And after he asked how we slept, he wanted to know about our health, if we're well, and he wanted to know if Mick is well, because Mick was extremely thin. And are you well? And Mick said yes, and I was very thin. And he said, no, this is my normal weight. And Baba said, you should eat more chapatis, and the sign for chapatis was like that. And, excuse me. And so there was just this little sort of chit-chat, how did you sleep and how's your health and all of this. And then he looked really serious. And it was almost like the air in the room, kind of, he just had this heavy sort of vibe that one could almost feel. And he said, have you stopped taking drugs? Oh, and I forgot to tell you that after he wrote to us and said, stop taking drugs, we stopped taking drugs that day. And it had nothing to do with him. We were quite convinced because we had talked about it before. It was nothing but our willpower, our common sense. And literally, we stopped taking drugs that day. And we had no desire for it even the next day. People, our friends would sit around, smoke big joints and stuff. And we didn't want it. It was, not only did we stop, but the desire for it was completely gone at that time. And but it never, certainly didn't occur to me that he had something to do with it, that his writing and saying stop taking drugs, I mean, I didn't even really consider that as a possibility. And so when he said, have you stopped taking drugs? We said yes. And then he smiled. And apparently he was happy because we had obeyed him. I didn't quite catch on to any of this, you realize, but in hindsight, this is more hindsight than I actually realized, except when he smiled, he was just so beautiful. It was like the whole room lifted. When he was happy, so it was amazing. It was almost like one could levitate without going to this course in Bangkok. And it was just a feeling from the heaviness of having stopped taking drugs to having made him happy was just amazing. And he asked, who do you take me to be? And the questions were generally directed at Mick first and then at me. And he said, who do you take me to be? And Mick had read God Speaks and a couple of those discourses. And Mick said, I take you to be the living Christ. And I remember going, what? I mean, I didn't It was so amazing to me. And again, it's so quick that all this happens. I couldn't sit there and contemplate what I was raised a Catholic, the living Christ, pretty heavy statement. And I hadn't caught on to the concept of the Avatar yet, obviously. I mean, I've been exposed to all the religions, having lived in the Middle East and in the Orient, Islam and Buddhism, but never occurred to me that the Avatar is all the same thing. And when Mick said, I take you to be the living Christ, it really surprised me. And not only did it surprise me, I didn't understand exactly what it meant, but I thought, why didn't he ever tell me that? Apparently he hadn't discussed that with me, because I really wasn't, it was his thing, I wasn't that interested. And Baba then looked at me, and I said, I have no idea. And so he seemed to be satisfied with what Mick said. He kind of nodded, and because I said, I have no idea, it seemed like he had to tell me who he was, because this guy obviously already got it or something. And he said, I am God in human form, and I know this because I constantly experience it. Just like you know you're a woman, through constant experience. You never ask yourself, am I a woman or am I a man? Through constant experience, you know you're a woman, and like that, I know that I'm God in human form. And when he said that to me, and he actually looked at me, I mean, not like this, but he made eye contact with me a bunch of times during that. And when he said that to me, not having any concept of God in human form, the only thing that I could feel was that's who he is. And I had no spiritual experience, mind you, that all of a sudden, that I hear sounds or heavens opens or something. No, it was just, he said it, and the way he said it with such authority that he couldn't be anyone but that. Because when God looks at you and says, I am God, he's God, that's it. And it was so overwhelming to me. I had no idea what to do with this, sitting there in front of God. Nor did I have time or presence of mind to think what this meant. And the only thing I could do is I started to cry. And I just sat there and I cried. And essentially for the rest of the meeting, that's what I did. I sat there and I cried. And so I sat there and I cried. And I did have nothing with me. All my stuff, backpack, everything was outside the door. I was wearing a pair of pants and a black sweater. And I was crying. And my nose was running profusely because I was crying. And so the only thing I could do, sitting there in front of God, was to wipe my nose, which left these silver streaks. Because otherwise it was just running. And what to do? You know, I couldn't wipe it on the, there was no carpet. The floor was this dirt. They weren't the carpets they have now. It was just the dirt. And so I sat there in front of God and snorted up my sleeve. And then there was a bit of small talk about, well, how would you go to the West, and how he was emphatic that we leave that day, that we not spend the night in Anamara, that we have lunch with Adi and go, be on our way back to the United States. And he said it was okay for us to go overland to Europe. And he said what he wanted us to do is to persuade young people from taking drugs. He said it was the highest spiritual work to be done in the world today, to persuade young people from taking drugs. And he also asked if we had read God Speaks and Stay with God, a book by Francis Bravazon. And Nick said he had read God Speaks, and I said I couldn't read it. My English was not good enough to read these things. And Nick said he'd never heard of Stay with God. And Baba said that God Speaks and Stay with God were the two most important books. And he instructed Adi to give that to us, and also there was a book in German, Liebe und Weisheit, and that Adi used to give it to me. That was a translation. And Adi used to give that to me. And he said, do you have any children? And we said, no. And living the life we lived on the road and how we lived, children was not something that we had any plan to have. And we also didn't want children. It wasn't something that particularly attracted us. But everybody in Asia would ask me, do you have a son? I could have 10 daughters, so forget about that, but do you have a son? And so to tell people that I don't want children, they kind of thought I was a bit of a freak or something. That's not an answer Indian women or Asian women as can understand. So I got used to saying later. When women would ask me if I would have a son or have children, I would say no, later. And so Baba said, do you have children? And we said no. And he said, do you want children? And Mick said no. And I said, later. And somehow he seemed to think that those two answers weren't compatible or something, because he said, well, what am I to do? Who am I to please? And I kind of didn't get it. And so I was just sitting there, you know, snobbing away. And he said, do you love Mick? And I said, yes. And he said, you're to tell me to please him. And he asked Mick, do you love Ushi? And he said, yes. And he said, you're to tell me to please her. And Mick said something totally brilliant, like he should only please himself. But I didn't say it. So that was the end of that. And I still don't quite understand what that was all about. Mick said another totally brilliant thing. Mick said, perhaps we cannot love you the way you are to be loved, but we can promise to obey you 100%. And I remember Baba didn't miss a beat. He didn't even pretend to hear it. It's like, he just went right on. It wasn't like, yeah, oh yeah, good. No. He just went right on to the next question. I remember. So, yes, one youthful enthusiasm it is. So then he said that we should take the love, that we should take the love that he has given us and share it as freely as he has shared it with us, that we should take his love and we should kiss him and leave. And so I got up and kissed him on both cheeks, and I did. Baba kissed me on both cheeks, I kissed him on both cheeks, and we left. And the only thing that I remember, that it took me a while to remember that, actually. It wasn't an immediate thing, but I definitely, when I remembered, I really distinctly remembered his smell. And it wasn't at all like flowers or perfume or sweetness or something like that. It wasn't a scent. It was a human smell, I mean a person, but it smelled, the closest I could describe it was it smelled like a newborn baby. It smelled absolutely clean. Just like innocent, new, fresh, clean smell. It was really an amazing smell. Yeah. And so then we went on and went back to Europe and went off to the United States, and we settled briefly in Santa Barbara, and we met Adele in New York, and Fred and Ella Winterfeld, and all these folks, and then we met Robert Dreyfus, whom some of you might have met a couple of weeks ago, and we're sitting in Santa Barbara, and we were talking about the road. And one of these days, Mick and Robert said, let's go back on the road. And I was absolutely certain if we wrote to Baba and asked him if we could go back on the road, he would say no, and that's that. Because he already told us to go to the West and do drug work. So I didn't really have to lose face here by saying, nah, I don't want to go. I just knew we were going to write to, we wrote to Baba all the time. But this is these letters. Anyway, so we wrote to Baba and told him that what we really want to do, instead of doing this drug work in California, that what we really want to do is do this on the road. Because there are our brethren that we can relate to so much, these poor hitchhiking bums that are running around Asia, and them we have to get off of drugs. And I guess in hindsight, when Baba tells you to do something and then you ask him that you want to do something else, I guess he doesn't say no, but the original order sort of loses some impact from what I understand. So he wrote back and he said, I have no objections. And we saw that as like we have his order to go on the road. This was like, now we were the... And we sold everything, and we went to Europe, and we bought a VW bus with Robert, and our dog, we took our dog with us. I have no idea why. And we schlepped this dog from California to Europe back on the road. And in the whole time we were writing, we were in correspondence with Baba, and I'm sure there are some things that I can share. I don't know, I put a few. Oh. We had asked him, at one point we'd asked him about reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And again, this is not, this was just for us, but Baba said that we should just, well, Adi said, Baba said, these letters would be written to Adi, and then Adi would write back. And
There's no harm in your reading Baba literature as a pastime, though it may not contain the exact words of beloved Baba, which are so simple and understandable, and it is Baba literature. He must have thought about the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It is a wonder that this originality is not maintained in print. Maybe this isn't what I was looking for. I'm sorry. I'm not sure that is what that was about. Oh, here it is. Yes, Baba does not want you to read the Tibetan Book of the Dead in any such literature. You can read his literature and keep yourself well up in his teachings. You have to work for Baba, and you should keep yourself fully equipped for the task without deviation or demur. Baba says, and now we were planning to go back on the road. Baba says you have to come to India only when called for a visit, and no stay in India. And Baba said, the greatest service to the world at present is to make people stop taking drugs. So Baba wishes you both, Mick and Ushi, and also Robert, to do this with all your heart. Baba has no objections that you, Ushi, and Bob, 3 of you, plan to start on the way now, walking, hitchhiking, and helping the drug-afflicted young souls en route, inducing them with love and fervor to give up taking these drugs, explaining and convincing them that the end of this seemingly pleasurable drug taking has a disastrous end. And that he said, in your reply to your letter, Baba directs me to let you know that spiritually it is immaterial whether you settle in the States and visit him after November 1967, if and when he gives the call to his Western lovers, or go hitchhiking trying to contact the drug-addicted en route, giving them Baba's message and his love. That it's spiritually immaterial. I think it's kind of an interesting way of putting that, because he already told us to stay there. And then we took off on the road again with Robert, and we traveled all around Iran, and we went to Shiraz, and we wrote to Baba that we had visited the tomb of Hafiz. And he wrote back and said, we're not to visit spiritual masters and murshids or peers or walis, and shouldn't go to shrines and things, tombs and all that kind of stuff. He just wanted us to, I guess, concentrate on him. And we were to go back, we could not enter India until November, and this is January of 1967. So by about February or March of 1967, we were living in Lahore, Pakistan, which is 16 miles from the Indian border. And we still had 10 months or so 8 months, 9 months to wait for going, what we wanted to do, see him again. And he didn't allow us to go back to India. So we sat there, we rented a house, and it was on the one road that was between India and Pakistan, and from India to the west, and all the people who hitchhiked to and from India had to go in front of our house, had to come through that area. And so we had lots and lots of hippies and drug-taking people stay with us. And we would tell them about Baba, and we would tell them about how taking drugs was not the way to go. And we would write to Baba, and he would write back to us. And then, for what reason we really couldn't understand, one day the 3 of us started to take drugs again. And I'm not sure why, we just did. And
That's
Robert and Mika. And
This is what year?
1967, about May. All I know is it was 120 degrees in the shade at that time. It was the summer in Pakistan. It was unbelievable. So we wrote to Baba, and we told him about it, and we confessed. And
After one time, or?
maybe a couple days. Yeah, 2 or 3 times, I'm not sure. And it's here somewhere. I haven't quite found it yet. Well, we wrote to him a bunch telling him about how we were doing all this drug work. And then Robert wrote, for reasons which I cannot articulate to you or myself, Mikushi and I have disobeyed Baba. On March 25th, the 3 of us, independent of one another, without having previously discussed it or even thought about it, smoked hashish. I could say we have stopped, but that would be wrong because we never really began again. Absurd as it may sound, it just happened. One positive value of the experience is that our memories were quickly refreshed as to what we have been speaking to all these people about, and like that. And then Baba wrote back and he said, your letter from Lahore was read to Baba. In reply to your letter, Baba directs me to convey to you at Mikanushi that he wants you to know that he has forgiven you 3 and he wants you never again to indulge in things contrary to his message that you 3 are carrying out to the drug people with such love and diligence. Baba remarked that he expects you 3 to obey him implicitly in this matter, for this is his order for the 3 of you. He also wants you not to feel worried over what happened, for he has forgiven you 3. He wants you 3 to resolve never to succumb again. Baba wants you to, this was to Robert, wants you to make Mikanushi also read this letter, send his love, and Baba sends his love and blessings to you. So the next day, a letter came that said, Avatar Meher, there's a form letter that said, Avatar Meher Baba directs me to inform all of his followers, lovers, workers that he will not attend to any correspondence other than emergency telegrams and cables, and very important letters concerning Baba work directly. And none should write any more letters to me, this was signed by Adi Kirani, or members of the Mandali residing with him regarding their personal affairs and the affairs of others. So we, for a year and a half, had been writing to him about anything we wanted to and got letters back. There's one letter in here someplace, someone had told us that her guru said it's not good to sleep in the same room with your dog. So we wrote to Baba, beloved Baba, do you think we should sleep in the same room with our dog? And Baba wrote back and said, absolutely, it's fine. You can sleep in the same room with your dog. This is how trivial some of these letters were. We were, anything that happened, we would write to Baba. Of course, what else are we to do but to write to Baba? So after this thing of disobeying him, comes this letter, no more letters. So we are kind of out here on Mars, I think, sitting at the Pakistani border at 120 degrees in the shade by 8 o'clock in the morning, and Baba says no more letters. And one of these letters says that our entrance into India, which was supposed to be in November, was postponed to January of '68 and then indefinitely. And so there we sat, and we were supposed to wait there to go to India to see him again. No, we weren't supposed to, we thought that's what we wanted to do. And it was quite interesting how after disobeying him and getting his letter back from him, that was so loving and so sweet and so forgiving, then it's like the doors shut, and no more letters, no more anything. And Robert decided to go back to Europe, and we thought we would stick it out for a bit longer, and then Mick and I both got hepatitis and we were very sick. And eventually went back to Europe because we just couldn't stay there anymore. And of course Baba never called us again. He was, meanwhile, late '67, he was very strict seclusion. And when we came back to the United States, eventually we wrote to Erich and we asked that we had some things we wanted to tell Baba. And he wrote back and he said, Baba permits you to tell him anything. And so we wrote him a letter, there was many pages, and we put in really everything we could think of that we might have missed telling him about, and including the fact that we had taken drugs, and disobeyed him with that. And he wrote back a letter that had 10 points that addressed each point individually, and again, he's so loving, and he said, Baba, once you, well, Susan, and there it is, and it's just, a lot of things are quite, personal things, but Baba has forgiven you both for having taken the drugs and for having continued to take for some time. Baba wants you both not to feel worried or anxious over your having disobeyed him because he has forgiven you both. Once again, Baba sends his order, capital letters, for you both not to take drugs, underlined, for the sake of just taking them when you get the whim or craving to do so. Baba does not want you both to take any drugs except, of course, medicines when prescribed by medical practitioners. And so it sort of wrapped it up, fortunately, I think, for me anyway, in a sense that I had that opportunity to write that last letter to him and have him answer. And the next time, of course, that there was communication was after he passed away, and we all went to the 69 Darshan. And so that's the end of my story.
Question, I have two questions. The first time I ever heard you tell your story was in 1970 in Meherazad.
Oh my goodness.
But anyway, and it never ended in Berkeley. It never, and so it's fresh every time. But there were a couple things. When you were at the house in Pakistan and you started taking the drugs, you wrote to Bob and told him you had, and he wrote back and said, "Stop." You continued. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then the other thing was when you said that you gave up the drugs that originally weren't. I mean, you've been talking about smoking hash and this and that, but weren't you doing some very heavy-duty drugs that you don't just you don't just stop without going through serious withdrawal?
Yeah, when we were in, this is before we had heard of Baba, we were in Southeast Asia. We started smoking heroin. The Chinese at that time, I'm sure still, did that. No, it wasn't a common thing to inject it because the heroin that they had at that time in Southeast Asia was pure, and it came in the form of a hard chunk. It wasn't powder yet. It wasn't diluted with anything or mixed with anything. It was the pure stuff, and what they did is they shaved it into powder with a razor blade and smoked it. And we did that for quite a long time. Yes, we did that for maybe 9 months or so. And we literally never stopped long enough to see whether we would get sick. I wasn't going to be quite so graphic. That's why I didn't. It's not that I didn't want to talk about it, but I mean, it got pretty heavy out of drugs.
But
yeah, I mean, I never.
But when you stopped, you didn't go through withdrawal. That's the point I was making, because people may be thinking, oh, they smoke some dope and stuff, big deal. But it's a huge deal that you never went through withdrawal.
Nothing.
After Bob was ordered to stop taking drugs.
I smoked it every day for a long time, and it was pretty. I mean, clearly, in hindsight, we were addicted, obviously, but we literally never stopped long enough to see if we would get sick. We didn't have to, because we had lots of it, and it was cheap and available.
But hadn't you seen other people who had stopped it and tried to go cold turkey and had the most horrendous withdrawals?
Of course. Oh, absolutely.
Well,
a number of my friends died.
Didn't you think, gee, this is rather strange that we don't have any cravings?
Huh.
Or
no, it was our willpower or something. We were. I don't know. It was just. I mean, it was obviously about doing. No, not really. We were terribly rational after many years on the road, But
whatever happened to the silent man? Because I think you have, and Mickey have both had a very good record of obedience compared to so many others, particularly
you must
this
know
man.
what happened to the
I
silent
remember
man,
he was someone that we used to, in New York, get communication about.
He was one of
because
them.
he totally disobeyed.
He was one of the Miami boys. He was, there was a group of Baba lovers from Miami.
Yeah.
They were called the Miami boys.
So
There
you
was
stand
Ed
in
Short.
great contrast to
Ed
some.
Short was a heroin addict, as I recall, after he met
Never
Baba
heard
in
of him
'62.
after that.
Ed Short passed away. Ed Short died. Oh, I don't know what. But Steve Simon.
Yeah. That's
Steve
cool.
Simon died in a prison in Colombia.
Dealing drugs?
He never gave up. Baba told him, sent us copies of the orders he gave him, and we just never heard from him. We understood that he never gave it up. Nice to find him.
Ursula?
Just a minute, please.
Actually, I have one question. You mentioned Beyond Words video by Louis Extra, and in that, Baba specifically talks about this drug and how people taking drug, they feel that they're experiencing God and they feel that intoxication, and he explains the difference and so forth. So listening to you, I was thinking that obviously when you were taking the drug, there was a feeling of so-called comfort or intoxication and stuff like that. You were experiencing that was a sense of comfort for you. But meeting Baba in Mandalay Hall, and when he actually asked, he actually did allow you and me to go and meet with him. Just meeting with him, and especially when he explained, and he did say, he declared that he is God, he is God in human form and so forth. What was the feeling that you were experiencing then, meeting Baba, and compared to the feeling that you were getting after taking drugs? I mean, is, in a practical
I
sense,
understand your question.
Yeah.
It was the feeling, well, not all drugs are obviously created equal. I think there are some that have different effects than others. And I think when Baba was talking about people having spiritual experiences on drugs, or feeling that they are spiritually advanced or something, I think he was mainly talking about psychedelic drugs that make you think that. And I was not, I took that a couple of times, I never did much of that. But the feeling of the other drugs that we were taking, it's sort of, I think in hindsight, a sense of feeling dulled, your senses being more dulled. It's sort of like, especially on heroin, it really feels like you're wrapped in some kind of a pink cotton cloud. It's warm and is comfortable, and it's sort of woozy and all, but it doesn't in any way compare with him sitting there. First of all, when he said to me that he was God in human form, it was quite powerful. It wasn't, but hugging him and kissing him, there was a sweetness to him and a love. And in those letters that he would send to us, there was such love. But when he said that he was God, it wasn't love as much as it was just authority, and really quite powerful. So to compare the two, to compare any kind of experience on drugs with, it couldn't be more different. It's just doesn't relate one to the other at all. It doesn't compare at all.
I mean, afterwards, after you did meet him, did you kind of came up to this conclusion that this is a different feeling? I mean,
oh yes, I never compared him to drugs. It wasn't either or, really. No, and when we disobeyed him, it was over a year later. You know, it was more than 1 year later. So perhaps this feeling of being with him had not worn off a little, but one tends to rationalize and forget. And especially since, you see, where we started to disobey him was to leave the United States to begin with. When he told us what we're to do is to come here and do drug work. And for us then to say, well, yeah, but what we really want to do is be back on the road, that's already where the whole thing got blown. You see, as far as I can see it now, I can't imagine how it could have worked out any different.
When you did slip back for that period, was it so much a renouncing of his order, or were you thinking of his order more
Oh no, it was a
violent?
total guilt trip.
Total guilt.
Oh yeah, we were like, oh no, we were felt like absolute rats, but
But you kept on doing it.
yes, dear.
Did,
Happy rats.
Ursula, did Bob give you any guidelines about how he wanted his message about drugs to be carried to others? Number one, and also, is there any organized effort amongst Baba lovers to carry Baba's message about drugs today?
Well, I'm not really familiar with anything today, but eventually after, in 1969, after the second trip when I came back to the United States, I worked as a drug counselor for years. Yeah, I was the in-house drug counselor at John F. Kennedy High School in Richmond, California, which is a garden spot. I worked with Alan Cohen, and so did Robert, for some years. Yeah.
And what did you say to high school students?
Well,
you wouldn't like get into Baba, but
no, I didn't. But at that time, I didn't have any degree in any psychological counseling or anything. But what I did have is that I had taken drugs and I was no longer taking drugs, and therefore I was able to relate to kids better than someone who had never taken them, just like a parent who told them this is really bad. You know. At least I was able to
be in their shoes and
yeah, to some degree,
aware of what it's like. Sure.
Yeah. But today I don't know. Then there was a big effort in the early 70s. I remember Adele.
Yes.
You know, things were published, God in the Pill, that pink pamphlet.
Hundreds
we
and
were
hundreds
in
of booklets that were
schools.
sent to us that we, God in the Hill.
Yeah, Rick Chapman, Alan Cohen, Robert, and many others, and the Sufis were really very involved in Phyllis. Yeah.
Oh, Phyllis did right here.
Right.
I just, I'm thinking of all the phases of your life. There's so many other things you've done. You've helped numerous people as a travel agent. That was a very interesting part of your life.
Yeah.
And then the wonderful work you did as, what was it, a detective or
Private eye.
FBI agent? What?
Private
detective? What were you, private detective?
I was a private investigator for 7 years. Yes.
Well, all of that, your past experience was very helpful.
That's true.
Resource.
Ursula, I'd love to know what you said to Mick the next day after meeting Baba. I mean, here he comes out and says that in front of you. You must have had something to say to him, like, "Hey, why didn't you at least give me a clue what we were walking in on this?" You know, so sort of like that.
I did. He kind of explained to me. Mick really sort of explained to me the concept of the avatar. He had read God Speaks, and I really couldn't. I mean, my English was not such, and nor did I, even after meeting Baba, I didn't, it was an emotional feeling. It was kind of a heart thing for me, rather than, now I want to know how the planes of consciousness work. Eventually, I actually read God Speaks 5 times, but that came later, after I settled in the United States. And so Mick sort of more or less explained to me the concept of the avatar and how he comes back and all that. And he had already apparently gathered that out of what he was reading. Yeah.
What's your experience in 1969 when you went for Baba Darshan?
I was really sad. I remember sitting in Lumley Hall and the same place, the same spot that I had sat 3 years earlier, and there was the empty chair. There wasn't anything nice about it as far as I was concerned. I mean, the feeling, of course, in Guru Prasad was wonderful, and the meeting the Mangli. I never met the Mangli, because I just went there, met Adi, and met Baba, and then boom, left town. I never returned to meet Erich. I never met the women. And so that all was very nice, but to sit there and there was the chair and he wasn't there, that was sad. I didn't like it. I didn't really know how to feel all universal about it. You know, it's just to me, I missed him. And I couldn't write any more letters and ask him dumb questions like about my dog. And I missed him. In a sense, the letters, I go through some of these letters, I was fairly innocent, I guess, and then I was sort of, the way I had started to speak English, I wrote these sort of bumbling love letters to him, you know, and I just missed it, you know.
What grew to Versad?
In 69 Dasha.
Oh, at 69 Dasha?
Yeah, is what he was asking how I felt about 69 Dasha. Oh, it's getting late, Adele says.
No.
The fact that you and Nick and Robert all decided to take drugs the same day, you said independently of each other, and you get this letter of forgiveness from Bob, and then no more letters. Do you think he arranged that? I mean,
I don't know. Temptation is always there.
on the same day.
I don't know.
Seems like he did that for some reason.
No, I think I did. I take responsibility.
Yeah, really good shipment of drugs that day or something.
I know. Well, thank you. Huh?
How did that become the United States when you're not allowed something to do that?
I got a visa. We just happened. The United States Embassy forgot to ask me for my police record.
And what's the thing in India? Did you see those people taking drugs and being living on people money?
Oh, Benares?
Oh.
Anywhere. Anywhere. Yes. Up at the river, mainly in the north, mostly.
Oh, this year I think.
They don't.
Thank you.